Hello. So I'm doing a talk tomorrow at Factorial, where I work, factorial.io, about this post that I wrote in December last year for the 12 Days of Web. So I thought I would use YouTube and do a live stream to kind of practice, rehearse for tomorrow. So I'm not going to go into all of the details, because the talk tomorrow is not so much about all of the details of Shadow Dom and web components and da-da-da-da-da. But feel free to read through this post. I'm pretty proud of it. I think there's a lot that you can take away from here and potentially use in your day-to-day. I've put a link to it in the description, so feel free to grab it there. So what I want to do is just look at the different ways we can do web components, and then specifically also around Shadow Dom, of course, and what Declarative Shadow Dom is and what it kind of opens up in terms of how we can use web components. So one of the reasons why this is pretty exciting and why it's especially of interest to us over at Factorial and will be to many other agencies and companies is one of the blockers for using custom elements and using Shadow Dom specifically is the fact that it is 100% dependent on JavaScript. And therefore, unless you are, for example, server-side rendering it using some kind of node server, you will not be pushing anything to the browser on initial load. It'll only be more than hydrated. You won't just hydrate by adding some event listeners, but you will actually have to also get the content, maybe doing a fetch request to a endpoint that will return the data, and then you can populate the template and then do your hydration and all this kind of stuff. But of course, if you're building an app that's like behind a login or something, that's totally fine. For the most part, of course, you still have the problem of potentially your JavaScript not functioning, not loading, not failing to execute, and then you have a problem. But Shadow Dom is not going to help you with that problem anyway. You have much bigger problems now. But in terms of like more public-facing web properties, where maybe you're using a component architecture and you would like to move to more of the web platform, but you have this limitation because you want some isolation, especially maybe with your CSS. Now, that's where you need to rely on Shadow Dom, right? Because that's one of the things that Shadow Dom gives you is this encapsulation. So stuff doesn't leak in or leak out of the Shadow Dom. There are some caveats, and I'll mention a little bit of that. But those caveats are you are being deliberate in making use of it. So it's not a by accident kind of thing, and like, oh no, stuff's leaking into my Shadow Dom or stuff's leaking out of the Shadow Dom. It's more that you have implicitly chosen for stuff to go into your Shadow Dom. Anyway, we'll get back to that. So, but if you are, for example, doing a lot of development where you are basing something on Drupal, for example, or let's say, Laravel, let's say Ruby on Rails, Django, any of these things. Of course, now, if you have this UI layer that is then dependent on either doing these fetches via JavaScript in the DOM, meaning you can't push stuff down to the web that's already like all your HTML content, now you have to do an additional integration where you kind of have to do a pass off from the one server-side process to another server-side process before it can actually go to the browser. And of course, the more you add things like this, the more complex your infrastructure, the more potential points of failure there are, and generally the slower your response is going to be, because maybe your PHP stack is doing some of the work, maybe accessing the database and doing some rendering of the template. But now, because you are not using Declarative Shadow Dom and you need to make use of Shadow Dom, you are reliant on JavaScript to kick in and enable the Shadow Dom and enable the content to be visible. For that, you now need to pass it on to a server-side a JavaScript server-side solution, a Node server, or any of the other ones that's available, Dino, or these, you have to pass it off to that to do that part of the rendering and then pass it down to the DOM. Now, there are different solutions and things that you can use, but oftentimes you now get locked into a specific framework. And this is what we're trying to avoid, right? We're trying to avoid being locked into a framework by relying on the web platform, open web standards. So that is a lot of preamble. Let's have a look at some code. So on my GitHub, I've pushed, 5 repositories. Each one explores the Shadow DOM and web components in a little bit of a different way. And we'll kind of start at the lowest end and then we'll move up and up and up. So, if you go to my GitHub and you just type in Shadow, you will get the 5 ones. And we're going to start off with right at the base, which is, that would be, let me open this in a separate one here. So cd, so this is Shadow core HTML. Okay, let me open this up in VS Code. Right, so this is no declarative Shadow DOM. So this is basically, if you're not using declarative Shadow DOM, we're going to look at the downsides here. So we have our custom element here, and we have a template that contains basically, here we have a unordered list, and we have a couple of list items in here. Each of these you will see is basically a different social network link. And then we have some other content here. We have an individual one list item because this will be one user card. And then we have some elements here with, just tags that we want to use. And we don't want to have to, you could also write all of this in JavaScript, but we're not going to do that. And also you could write it in JavaScript, make it a little easier for yourself by using something like lit. But with this, I'm trying to stay to just the web platform for this part of the exercise. So we won't use lit or anything like that. We're just going to be, okay, what can we do with just a web platform? And to avoid having to write all of this HTML in your JavaScript, we're just creating a template here, and then we will use that. So we have some global CSS that we're just linking up here, and we have this user card. So this is all the styles for our card and also a list of cards. And you can see that's not linked anywhere here. And the reason for that is because once we take this template, we render it out into our custom element, and we then lock it into our Shadow DOM, then having the link there at the top in our head, bringing in user carded CSS, it's going to have absolutely no effect because of the Shadow DOM, right? We're opting into this. We're saying we want this isolation. And so therefore this will not work. We have to get that CSS into our Shadow DOM somehow. There are different ways you can do this. I'm going to show you one way that is pretty common. So if we jump into Nimbus Team, so we're basically using your normal class, and we're extending HTML element. This is pretty much how you do web components. And then right at the bottom here, we're registering and defining our Nimbus Team web component, our custom element. Then we just have a bunch of selectors. These are all the things that we want to grab out of that template and then fill with data. We just have some private variables that's going to hold some of our data. And then we have a constructor function. It attaches the shadow, and then it loads our CSS. So this is the first thing. So what we're doing is we're creating a style element. Then we're using fetch to actually grab the CSS from user card that we saw earlier. If that was successful, we're getting the text content. We're appending that. We're sticking that into the style element. So you can see style.textContent is await response.text. And then we just append that style to the Shadow DOM. So that means that it'll basically be, we'll see in a second. So, right. So, and then We have our connected callback. So this is a lifecycle function. And basically, as soon as our custom element has mounted, then it will call this function. This function will be executed. And this is just calling this.render, and render is our function. This can be called anything. I'm just calling it render because, this is a common name that's used a lot. So the first thing we do is we get our template element. If there isn't one, we return. We have a problem. Now we're checking if we have any users. If we don't, then we're going to load some users. Again, this is doing a fetch request to this fictional API that I spun up. That's just a Netlify function that will just respond with some JSON. And then if the response was OK, we're setting this.users to whatever that was, right? So then we head back. Now we create our UL, and we add our class list onto it. And now for each of our users, we're doing all the things. We're cloning our template. We're getting the email. We have the phone, all these different social media thingies, and some accessible text. And then we're filling in that template here in JavaScript. So we're looking at these placeholders, and we're replacing them with the appropriate thing. And at the end of all of that, we're going to append the list container. So we'll have our style at the top, right? That contains all our CSS. And then we'll have our UL with all our cards at the bottom. So that's everything that's happening. It's quite a lot of JavaScript. Not super complicated, but some of this isn't great to have to write like this. And again, you can alleviate some of this by using something like lit. But again, I'm trying to say, what can we do with just the web platform? Some of these things, again, we could use string literals, string templates to do some of this. But let's leave that aside. There's many ways to do things, but let's just stick with this. So with all of this done, we are ready, right? And we can try this out. So let me go back here, and I'm just gonna npx. So I'm just gonna npx to run HTTP server. Now this is first gonna open up in a different browser. It's not gonna open in the browser. Great. So let's go back. And so then let me just open DevTools. And so we're gonna run it. There we go. So you see, it took a second because, we can see over here, for example, let me zoom in a little bit. Let me stick it on the right-hand side. Maybe that's a little easier. So we can see here is that fetch request to fictional folks that happened, and all our JavaScript and all that kind of stuff. So now here's the downside. If we go into our panel over here and we disable JavaScript and we refresh, there's nothing. And there won't ever be anything, because there is literally nothing to display other than just our core elements. So all there is our empty custom element, which isn't defined either. So the browser just basically ignores it. And we have our document fragment with our template here. But there's no data in it or anything like that. OK, so that is no declarative Shadow Dom, just HTML, CSS, JavaScript. So now let's move on a little bit. And let's say, OK, so what is the deal then with declarative Shadow Dom? So the main difference here is, so if we do neo shadow HTML, and then I'll go ahead and close this one, and then let's open this one. OK, so again, we have our global CSS, no difference here. It's imported here, no difference. We have a user card. It's, again, no difference. It's just a CSS file that lives in our CSS folder. But here's the first difference. We are actually importing it just with a normal link. And we'll get to why and how that is working. This time you can also see, in our previous one, we had our custom element here. And then outside of our custom element, we had our template, right? technically you could put it inside and it'd be fine, but generally you don't do that most of the time, because sometimes you might want, you don't want to necessarily have to repeat your template over and over. You just want it once in your HTML, and then you can. So why I'm saying that is, let's say, for example, you have Nimbus team and then you're using it somewhere else again. If your template is co-located inside your custom element, you'd have to copy that over again, potentially. So normally you have your templates outside of it. There's a reason we're putting it inside now. And that is because of this attribute, shadow root mode open. It can also be closed, same as when you attach shadow with JavaScript. And what this will do, we will see in a second. Now, we're going to see a downside here. And that is that, well, first the upside. We're just writing HTML. It's just HTML, nothing funny here. We have everything in here. Here's our HTTPS, our blah, blah, blah. This is not a template. It's a template, but the data is already, all the data is already there. There's a reason we're using the template, and we're going to see that in a second. But we're just writing HTML. There's no JavaScript to inject any of these things. It's right here, written by hand. The downside, of course, is here's only one user's card in here. If you wanted multiple, well, you'd have to duplicate it. So you'd have to put each one in there individually. But we're only in a HTML, CSS, JavaScript world right now. No frameworks, no static site builder, no server-side anything, right? So we are constrained by that. Now, what does the JavaScript look like? The JavaScript, that's it. That's all there is. One thing you might be asking is, but what about attaching shadow? We will see this in a second. So I'm going to just open this up. Same deal, npx HTTP server, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So let's again go back in here. I'm going to stick this at the bottom, and then localhost 8080, right? Instantaneous. That's the first thing you'll see. And that's obvious because there's no need for a fetch request to an endpoint to get the data. It's already right there in the HTML. This, of course, also means that if I disable JavaScript and I refresh, everything is still fine. Now, because we now, of course, Nimbus team, so this custom element, the browser doesn't know what that is, but it doesn't care because it's only going to look at what's inside, and we're finding a shadow root. And that is what's happening. Like when the browser encounters this template with this shadow root mode open in there, this is the declarative shadow DOM part. So we are declaring that there needs to be a shadow root. And what the browser is doing is it's taking this template, and obviously it's accompanying closing tag, it's removing it, it's taking everything that's inside of it, and it's pushing it into a shadow DOM that it's creating inside our custom element. So therefore, even when the JavaScript's running, we don't have to do attach shadow here because it's already there. This is one of the other things you get. If your JavaScript actually executes, the browser will make available the shadow root to your JavaScript already. So you don't have to manually create it, so to speak. So this is pretty neat. But of course, as mentioned, and you can see here, our style sheet is just imported. And the thing is, it is not leaking out, and nothing is leaking in, neither. Okay, so this is pretty cool. So we can go back and then enable our JavaScript. By the way, if you're wondering how I'm doing that, it's just Command-Shift-P, so pretty much like you would do in like VS Code. And then you can do disable JavaScript. You can do all kinds of stuff from basically this palette here. Okay, so now we have JavaScript enabled again. Nothing really changes. The only thing that really changes now is that we actually have a shadow root inside our JavaScript if we need to attach more things to if we wanted to append more things into here. And of course, If we had a button here, for example, that you could click and it would open a dialog maybe with like a contact form for this specific user, then with JavaScript disabled, that would not work. But then when JavaScript's enabled, this is the kind of hydration you can do within your JavaScript by attaching event handlers and that kind of good stuff. But we're set with this thing that, you don't necessarily like, it's not very maintainable if you have to write all of this HTML by hand. So let's take one step up the chain. So now we're going to leave just the HTML part, and we're going to move into using Astro. So astro.build, static site generator. Of course, it's a lot more than that nowadays, but we're primarily going to be using the static site generation aspect of it. A little bit more, but we'll see that in a second. So we're going to go into Shadow Core. Oops, CD, there we go, Shadow Core, but not HTML. Cool, okay. Now let's jump into VS Code, right, let's close everything. Okay, so we have an index.astro here that is basically bringing our layout, and here's our layout. It imports our global.css, same CSS file, nothing different here. Global.css, there it is. Same one as the others. We're just importing it in a different way because if you do it like this in Astro, then it does some pre-processing and minifies all that kind of good stuff. But so we're taking a little bit advantage of that there. Here we just added like an article at the top, well, some text at the top that the other one didn't have, and then we have this Nimbus team component. So let's dig into that one. Now, here again, because we are inside a framework, we are taking advantage of some of the things it can do. So one of the things that Astro can do is during build time, it can make requests to external services. So in this case, because we have it up here, this will not be executed in the browser. This is executed during build time. So during build time, it's going to make a fetch request here. It's going to get the data, and then it's going to render the rest of our template. So again, this will look very familiar to you, but here's the difference now. We're not doing all of this stuff in the JavaScript. We could do that, but we get a nicer syntax here, right, than what we were doing in a little bit nicer, especially in terms of how we write this, right? So here we're just using like a JSX type syntax to build up all our users. So now, of course, in this case, we are going to not get a template with just one list item and just one user card. It'll have all of the user cards. So in this case, we're saying 2, and so there'll be 2 user cards, right? So all of that will be, so now JavaScript's already simpler in this case. So again, we attach our shadow, we load our CSS, and we're doing the same thing here. We're getting the Windows href, we're using that to construct where we're getting our user card CSS from. If all that's good, we do the same thing. Nothing different there. We don't have a load users because that's going to happen during build time. We still have our connected callback, but all this does is if there's a template, then it's going to go ahead, create the UL. It's going to clone our template, and this adds the CSS class. Then it's going to basically just list container append the content and append that, the list container, then to our shadow. So already we're seeing less JavaScript down here. So let's see what happens when we run this. So now I'm not going to do npm run dev, because if you do that, then it's going to not make this request. It's going to do it on the fly instead of during build. So we want to basically emulate a production environment. So to do that, we're going to do npm run build and then npm run preview. So there we go. It's building it. Great. So Now we can go in here. Let's open DevTools, localhost. All right. You can already see it's pretty snappy, right? Because a lot of the stuff we're already getting. Because you will see if you look in the terminal here, you can see here, this took a while to happen because it needed to do that external fetch and then it needed to build everything. So, but we're going to see something that's still limiting here. Because remember, we're not yet using Declarative Shadow Dom yet. So this looks all good, but now let's do Command-Shift-B and then disable our JavaScript and let's reload. Uh-oh, our user cards are gone. And that is because our JavaScript is not executing. So even though we have less JavaScript, we still need the JavaScript to execute in order for our content to be present. This means if SEO, for example, is important to you, then all of this content will not be available to search engine crawlers that don't have JavaScript, which is pretty much everyone except Google. But then even with Google, the first time it hits it, it might not have JavaScript, and then it kind of pushes out when it will recrawl your website. I don't know if that's still the case. That might have changed, and it might just do it on the first pass. But that's just one reason. The other thing is there's performance aspects that comes into play here a bit as well, and we'll see a little bit of that at the end. So, but if we look at the template here, we'll see here's our document fragment. And as I said, now because we have additional power here, we could actually build up that entire template with all of the content already there. So, we're already a little bit better off in terms of what's in the DOM, but that is still not what's available to the user, right? Cool. Okay, but things are starting to look a bit better. So let's just enable JavaScript again. If we reload, bada bing, everything is good again. All right, so now we move another level up. So now we're going to go into Neo Shadow. So let's see. Let me close this one, and let's open this code. Boop. All right. So everything is the same. Let's start with the layout. Again, just importing global CSS. Nothing here is different. We have our page, same deal. It's just some text here, and then we have our component. Now, this is where things start getting interesting. Again, same deal. We're doing this during build time because, why would you not take advantage of that? And then here, again, this is going to look familiar. We have our custom element, then we have our template, but now we're adding shadow root mode here. Here, we're also doing a little something extra, which we could have done. I'm going to be honest, we could have done this with the previous version as well. So what we're doing here is we're injecting the CSS directly into the page. We're losing something here because Astro is not going to minify and optimize the CSS here. It was also not going to do it for the other one. So this is still something we're losing here. But there are probably ways that we can address this in the future. There are some options that is coming up already. For example, with things like, what is it called? Import attributes, that might open some of this opportunities up to us. But again, you're sticking the text of the CSS directly into the HTML. So you're one less request already. So if you have multiple components and you're doing this, then for each of those, you shave off one request. Now, is request that big of a deal in today's HTTP2, almost HTTP3 world? Don't know. But yet again, we're shaving off some requests, right? Also, in this case, we're going to get 3 user cards. The rest of this is the same. We're just looping through everything and building up all of that. So again, within our template, there will be all 3. But again, we're already including our UL because we won't have to construct any of this. Because if we scroll down to the bottom, again, that's it. That's all of the JavaScript. It's just to define our custom element. That's all. That's the only JavaScript we need. That will run in the browser, to be clear. The only JavaScript we need to run in the browser is these lines. Of course, during build, a lot of other JavaScript is going to run. All right, so let's do the same thing here. So npm run build and npm run preview. It's doing our fetch, building up everything. Nice. Okay. Let's open this up. Localhost. Again, nice and snappy. The only thing that takes a little longer are the images, and that is because they are loading from that remote resource. That's why they're taking a bit longer. But there they are. And now if we disable JavaScript and we refresh, it's there. Because if we look in here again, we have our shadow root that we declaratively told the browser that we want. So it created that. It took everything, removed it. By the way, it removes the template tags completely out of the DOM, right? It doesn't leave them there. If your browser doesn't support Declarative Shadow DOM, then the browser will just leave that template alone. So you can write fallback code to then take the template and do whatever you need to do with it. But if Declarative Shadow DOM is there, it basically, how can you say that? Like, there was this thing, unwrap. It unwraps the template, and it takes what's inside and it wraps it back into a shadow root. Right here, we can see that style, but we can see it's not minified or anything, right? But again, no extra request needed for that. And then we can see like everything is just straight in there. Our data is right there. And then there's a little bit of JavaScript. That's it. Pretty neat. So you can already see how this is super beneficial. When you are wanting to build components, you want that isolation that the Shadow DOM gives you, but you also want to be able to take advantage of server-side rendering. In this case, it's build time rendering, not server-side rendering. With that said, at Factorial, for example, we do quite a lot of things with Drupal. And one of the reasons we use a form of web components or custom elements, primarily custom elements and template and that kind of thing, but we don't use Shadow DOM. And for the reason that we build quite a lot of sites with Drupal that is important for SEO, and that is public-facing stuff, right? Like content-heavy type sites or marketing type sites. So for those, we really want all the HTML to come down, right? We don't want just like a shell to come down and then we have to do all these fetch requests and all that kind of stuff. So that is why we do use custom elements and we do use template, but we don't use Shadow DOM because of this problem that until the JavaScript is executed in the browser, nothing will be shown to the end user. And that is not ideal. But let's take another look. So let's go back to this tab over here. And here I created a version of this using Declarative Shadow DOM in Laravel. So I'm by no means a Laravel expert or anything, but I got a basic thing working pretty easily. And I could deploy it using Vapor. So that is primarily why I went with Laravel and not something else. And I wanted to do something with PHP. So all that's happening here is we're using Vite, which will then inject the link and the JavaScript in here. Just a global CSS, nothing's changed. It's exactly the same one. We'll look at these two things very soon, and I'll tell you what I meant by there's some caveats. And then here's our app.js. We'll look at that in a second. This you can see is the same as you saw in Astra just now. And then this also looks very familiar. It's main with a slot, and then the slot will be replaced with the content for the page. Now, this is set up with a route for just /. And what I'm doing here is I'm returning all the data for the cards hard-coded. But this could have been a database call, right? Because this happens on the server. This is in PHP land. This is Laravel. This is running on the server. So this could do a database query and return this exact same data, but from a database query. I didn't want to mess with all of that as well, so I just hard-coded it. But where this data comes from is not important, because in the end of the day, we want this returned to our front end, which is then this home.blade. So here we can see we have our layout. And again, this is going to look very similar. We have Nimbus team, we have our template with our shadow root mode open. Here we have our style. And here we're using a function within Laravel. Actually, I think this might be just a PHP thing. And then it like uses Vite to basically return this. And in the end of the day, it does what we just did in Astro as well. And then we're just using Blade, PHP, but in a Blade template to, again, just loop through all of our information that we've gotten back from our route, and we're building up all of our cards, right? And then we had app.js. This just imports Nimbus team, and Nimbus team, again, is just those, like, 7 lines of JavaScript. That's it. And so I've got here running, I've got herd running, which is a really cool thing. I don't even think it's just for Laravel, but it runs all of the things, and it can do even more than what I'm using it for now. It's really, really nice. And so now I can go to neo shadow laravel.test, and there it is. That is server-side rendered with Laravel. It hit the route returned the data, it built up the template, and then the JavaScript ran, which basically just defined our custom element. And then everything inside here is our shadow root with our style. And you can see here, because we're running it through the Vite process, it's actually minified it for us as well. So now we're getting that benefit as well. And it's in there, and here's all our cards with all of the data straight up in here, right? It's being rendered on the server. And to prove that, yes, I'm going to disable JavaScript, and I'm going to refresh. And you can see, like, you didn't even see anything happening. So it's immediately there, all the HTMLs come down in one go. And so let's enable JavaScript again, and then reload. So this is how you can take advantage of Shadow DOM within all these different environments. And I think the other nice thing that you will notice, if you, for example, look here, like, all of this, these very small changes between what we did in Astro and what we're doing here. There's not a lot that I need to change to even be able to use this in a PHP world, a PHP Laravel Blade world, and an Astro like JSX kind of world. There's very little I need to change. It's almost interchangeable, right? It's just because of the underlying server-side language, and in the other case, the JavaScript templating language, that we need to make a few changes. But the HTML, that stays the same. There's little things here and there that you need to update, but there's a lot of reusability between things here. And we can potentially even get further with that if we start abstracting things a little bit more and that kind of stuff. But I think Declarative Shadow DOM has really opened up even more for us. And the thing that people has always said, yeah, but I can't server-side render. Well, now you can, right? So that's not something that's impossible anymore. You can totally do that. And as I showed you over here, you can even get the benefit of having minified optimized CSS that you can inject straight in. So you're cutting off that one request, and you're minifying your CSS through running on the server. And some of this happens at build and all these kinds of things, because you do have a build step with Laravel, right? So if you look in package.json, we have this, which does your Vite build, and that's going to create all of these CSS. So when we pull that in, that user card's already been minified. So that's why we're getting the minified CSS inside here. Okay, so there's one more thing I wanted to show you, and that is, if we look at user card, you will see here, we have this thing called color background primary, and we have color primary, and we have some typography stuff, And here are some icon sizes and some spacing, custom properties, CSS custom properties, but they're not defined anywhere in here because they're all defined inside our global CSS. So we can still make use of these globally defined custom properties inside the Shadow DOM, because custom properties is one of those things that can pierce the shadow, right? So if you define these and then you use these inside your Shadow DOM, these will pierce through and you'll be able to access them. So that means that you don't have to have this duplication of custom properties. You can still have all your tokens in a central location that's loaded globally, and everything can take advantage of that, no matter what. So these things will pierce that shadow. And it's not just here in the Laravel one, this is everywhere, including just plain HTML, CSS, JavaScript, no framework or static site builder or JavaScript or anything involved, right? This is just one of the ways that you can pierce the shadow and avoid any duplication. So there's no need for us to also pull in global.css into each and every shadow. By the way, another thing that the browser will do is if you do import the same CSS in multiple components, let's say, for example, you reuse the same component multiple times on a page, the browser will not re-request each CSS. It'll actually only do it once, and it'll be shared between all the different components. So the browser will do this optimization for you. And the other thing that I failed to mention is the conversion from the template to the Shadow DOM to basically taking all the contents of the template and sticking it into the Shadow DOM and making the Shadow DOM available to your JavaScript. This is happening during HTML parse time. That is, of course, why we don't still get everything we had before, even when you turn JavaScript off. This isn't the JavaScript engine doing anything like that. This is HTML parsing. It's during that time that this happens. So I'm pretty excited about it. We're going to see more and more ways we can use this over at Factorial. I'd love to know how you're using it. If you've used Declarative Shadow Dom, it's really well supported now. So let's quickly have a look at, can I use Declarative Shadow Dom? Let's have a look. So as you can see, it's fully supported from 1.11 in Chrome, from 16.4 in Safari, 123 in Firefox, 97 in Opera. It's got a 91.92% global. So, unless you really have to support older browsers, you can pretty much start using Declarative Shadow DOM today. And in my article that I linked at the beginning, I think at the bottom, maybe it's not over here, but inside here, in this long article, there is a link to a web.dev article where they do discuss how you can do a very, very simple polyfill for Declarative Shadow DOM. So I would say you can start experimenting and using this even in production starting today. So I hope you found this interesting. This was nice practice for me for tomorrow. So have a good one, and let me know how you use this. I'd be interested to know what people are doing with all this. I think the web platform is super exciting, and stuff's happening on all fronts these days. CSS is kind of bonkers at the moment, but JavaScript is in itself, and even HTML is really active at the moment. So it's an exciting time to be building for the web, and I'd like to learn more about what you're doing. So speak to you soon, and let me know if you want more videos like this. Cheers.